All right. So next chapter is, after we had defined Nawasib, is who are the Nawasib now, right? We have the definition, but we're gonna now specify who these people are. And the Nawasib, there are two groups. They're put into two categories. All of them together, they're just two categories. One is a religious sect, and the other are political parties, right? So there's two types. The political parties are some of the Umayyads, some of the Abbasis, and whoever else um, what was involved, in hatred towards Ali, or had held grudges against Ali or Ali's family. The Umayyads usually accused him of participating in Uthman's assassination, then turned against him and protested his rule. That's essentially what happened. So a political party would be the Umayyads. Now, the religious sect are the Khawarij. And they used to be from Ali's most loyal followers. They're from his most loyal Shia. Then they turned against him after the arbitration and they murdered him. They assassinated Ali radiallahu anhu. Now, these two groups which we just mentioned, the political parties that were Nawasib and the religious sects that were Nawasib, these two are not friends. They are not allies. In fact, they were enemies. So the Umayyads and the Khawarij, right, they both agree. They have very negative views of Ali, but they also have very negative views of each other. So they were fighting all the time. In the same way, Ibn al-Abbas and the Khawarij. So this is basically what we are talking about. Another one of the religious sects will be also the early Mu'tazila, which we'll mention later on. But for now, let's stick to the main two. And the main two that are the big theme here to Nasibism are Banu Umayyah and the Khawarij. These are the main two that you talk about when you're talking about Nawasib. The other two are very minor in this regard, and you'll see why. So we begin with the first group, which is the Khawarij, the religious sect that had hatred towards Ali. So after fighting alongside Ali during the civil war, they were outraged when Ali accepted to do the arbitration with Muawiyah ibn Abi Sufyan. Ali did the arbitration and there was going to be peace and there was going to be a solution. And these guys, they had extreme views of Muawiyah and they viewed him basically as a rebellious disbeliever. So when Ali strove for a peaceful solution and the two men were appointed from both sides to do the arbitration, we're talking about Abu Musa al-Ash'ari and Amr ibn al-As, they viewed this thing as treachery to the teachings of Islam and they viewed it as a heresy. So they argued from the Quran, there's a Quranic argument, that إِنَّمَا الْحُكْمُ لِلَّهِ, the judgment is only for God alone. And why are you appointing these two men to judge? Obviously, Ali replied back to them. He told them, I'm not putting the two men to judge, I'm putting the Quran to judge. These two men are judging by the Quran. So there was this whole back and forth, but there was no agreement. Therefore, these ex-Shia, they split from Ali's army, they accused him of blasphemy, and then sent assassins after him. At that point, obviously, these guys are no longer Shia. They were different sects which formulated different beliefs, and these were labeled as the Khawarij. And they had a bunch of names. Anyways, the Khawarij were not the only Nawasib who emerged out of the ranks of the Shia. There were other groups like Al-Kamiliyah, for example. This is a group of Shia that believed Ali was divinely appointed. These guys came later. Maybe 100 years later. There was this group. And they believed that Ali was divinely appointed, but they accused Ali of disbelief at the same time. And this is because they believed that Ali dropped his right by giving allegiance to Abu Bakr. And they viewed this as kufr. So some of today's researchers, based on this, they consider the Shia themselves to be Nawasib, since they insult some of the Prophet's family members, some of his uncles, some of his wives, some of his descendants like Zayd al-Nar or Ja'far al-Naqi, whom they call Ja'far al-Kadhab, or a whole bunch of them that they insult and they ridicule and they degrade. Sometimes Muhammad al-Hanafiyyah, they degrade Ibn Abbas, they degrade, Aisha. There's a whole long list of people that they degrade and insult. But again, calling the Shia Nawasib, This is a minority opinion, and this is not adopted by the scholars. We do not find in any of the books of the scholars of Ahl Sunnah that there's somebody who's, let's say, a Rafidi or a Shi'i who's also at the same time labeled as a Nasibi, right? You will never find that. So a Rafidi is a term for one thing, Nasib is a term for a completely different thing. This is because the Rafida loved Ali bin Abi Talib, right? So the norm is that to be a Nasibi, according to the popular opinion, you must hate Ali. Even if you hate other random members of the prophetic household, nobody will label you as a Nasibi. Like all the scholars of Ahl Sunnah knew, even in the early days, that the Shia, especially the Rafida, they had hatred towards certain members of Ahl Bayt, some of the people we just mentioned, but nobody ever labeled them as Nawasib. They would label them as Rawafid. So unlike other Nawasib, though, the Khawarij did not. They did not do smearing campaigns to ruin Ali's image. They didn't need to, since they went to extremes and considered him a disbeliever, and that his blood was permitted to be spilled. They're like, the guy's halal to be killed, and he's a disbeliever. They didn't need to ruin his image or ruin his reputation. That's something very minor for them. They just went to the very extreme and said, this guy's a kafir, end of story. They also had distinct theological opinions and viewed lying as a major sin that leads to hellfire. So they were really, really strict. The Khawarij, these Nasibis, they were really strict when it comes to lying. They would not lie. So they never lied or fabricated stories about Ali, and they were sincere. They sincerely hated him. Unfortunately, they sincerely hated him. And the Khawarij were mostly preoccupied with armed rebellions against the Umayyad governors. And they kept going, they kept doing so every couple of years. So the Umayyads would smite them, they would destroy them, and then the Khawarij would regain their strength, and they would do another rebellion. And it just kept on going and going and going. The hatred of the Khawarij is rekindled after their bitter defeat against Ali's army in Nahrawan. There's an area called Nahrawan. They were defeated there because Ali fought them. Many of their relatives and their friends died in that war, which kept the hatred for Ali in their hearts throughout the coming years. And they started passing it from generation to generation. And they have their own arguments. And even today, these guys, they exist. Just so that you know, these guys still exist today. And they're mainly in Oman, and possibly in some other areas, but mainly in Oman. And they have their books, and then you can find, they have arguments against Ali, arguments against Uthman, arguments against Muawiyah in their books. Not to be taken lightly, to be honest with you. So the Khawarij, these Nawasib, where are they based? And we're talking here geographically speaking. Where were they based back in those days? Where were the areas where they were mainly found? So they began in Iraq, generally, in Kufa, of all places, and in Basra as well. But they soon felt the need to leave to safer lands because they were not welcomed in Kufa and in Basra. And here I'm talking about the government, which is the Umayyad government, kicked them out. So they had to leave to safer areas where they can spread their beliefs, since the Umayyads always harassed them. So they moved to Oman after their defeat by Ali. They spread there and they dominated that land, and then they formed a government, and you can still find them to our very day. Hadramaut in Yemen, surprisingly, this was full of Ibadi Kharijites, and so is Zanzibar, which you call in English Zanzibar. In Arabic it's Zanzibar. This is East Africa, basically. Tanzanian islands, in Sajistan as well, they had large numbers and openly boasted about their belief among other cities around the Islamic Empire. In areas where they dominated, they would openly declare that Ali is a kafir or that Uthman is a kafir. They would not fear anybody. As for Africa, its people recently embraced Islam, because Africa was still newly added to the Islamic Empire at the time. They were ignorant of the teachings, which is normal. Anybody who's a new Muslim would be ignorant of the teachings of Islam. So they found a good, that's why the Khawarij were able to spread there really quickly, because they were expelled by the Umayyads. And when they were expelled, they had to go where? To the distant lands. And the distant lands were where? Were areas in Africa and some other areas. So they started spreading their madhab there. They were abused by some of the Umayyad governors, so their hearts were filled with anger. The leaders of the Khawarij took advantage of the situation. So in Africa, as you know, Umayyads, there's a popular belief that Umayyads were they were quite racist. They were quite nationalistic Arabs. They view Arabian people as higher than any other people. And so that caused them a lot of issues with the Persians, and that caused them a lot of issues with the Africans as well. And the Africans were really, really angry at the way some of the Umayyad, governors, some of the Umayyad chiefs, the way they treated them was not very good. So the Khawarij, they took the chance and they started, turning those people against the government, preaching anti-government sentiments. It is a part of the Khariji theology that Arabs and non-Arabs deserve equality. And this is also a Sunni belief. Unfortunately, the government didn't enforce it back then. Some of the other Khariji beliefs is that the government or the leadership is not limited to Quraysh. Now, this is something that opposes the view of Ahl Sunnah, or the majority of Ahl Sunnah, that view that leadership is limited to Quraysh. Khawarij did not view leadership as limited to Quraysh. So that appealed more to some of the Africans. They narrated, the Khawarij utilized several ahadith to spread, especially the hadith of the Prophet ﷺ, where he says, listen and obey even if your leader was an Abyssinian slave. They used this hadith a lot. And this won the hearts of a lot of the Africans. As a result, they spread like wildfire in Africa and were able to form armies as large as 400,000 people. And therefore, they also established a government in Africa. So that's as far as the Khawarij and where they were found in the ancient world in those early times. Next, we will be talking about Al-Umayyah, which is Bani Umayyah.